Greetings from the Jazz Cloud. I'm Richie Zellon, and in this lesson I want to reveal that special ingredient that immediately would hold everyone's attention in a Miles Davis solo. And I know right off the bat what many of you Miles fans are thinking. It was his use of space. Well, yes. The use of space was definitely a trademark of Miles's solos, but that's not what I'm referring to here. I'm actually going to show you a rhythmic and melodic device which Miles constantly employed to set up that space between the notes and make it really meaningful. So stick with me because I'm about to dissect fragments from 10 Miles solos from different eras in his career so you too can grasp and use this concept in your playing. Welcome back to the Jazz Guitar Channel. So what is this mysterious ingredient that I'm going to show you? I like to call it punctuation. And to show you what I'm talking about, I'm going to play and demonstrate Miles's use of punctuation in his opening to 10 different solos throughout his career. And although I'm using his opening statements and all these examples, you will find that this concept prevails throughout the remainder of his solos, thus giving meaning to his exemplary use of space between the notes. So as a celebration of this year's 60th anniversary since the recording of Kinda Blue, which is not only Miles's best-selling album, but also the best-selling album in jazz history, I'd like to start with his solo opening to So What? And it goes like this. Notice the asterisks in the notes representing punctuation. And we have two great examples here. First with the initial half note and then with the 2/8 note closing of the phrase. Let me point out something else that occurs here, especially when we end a phrase on a period, like in this initial example. Notice that Miles ends his initial phrase on the upbeat of 1. When you end a phrase on an upbeat, you create syncopation, which in turn makes the phrase swing. So remember this. Putting that period on an 8th note, which falls on an upbeat, will always make the phrase swing harder and give even more meaning to that space that follows. As a result, the listener will also have the time to digest the fact that you just completed a statement, and he'll be eagerly awaiting your next phrase. And we will see throughout this lesson that Miles would often end a phrase on an upbeat. And back to Kind of Blue, recorded in 1959. Wow, it is timeless. I just listened to it yesterday, and every note seems to grow in meaning with the passing of time. I tell you, this recording is like a fine vintage wine. But enough said. Let's listen to the opening of Freddie Freeloader from the same album. And this is the opening to Miles's second chorus. 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2. This is a blues, and Miles clearly implies a B-flat sus4 on his opening phrase. Miles doesn't end his first phrase on a downbeat here, but again ends it on an upbeat on the second phrase. Next, let's examine how Miles used these same concepts on his opening to another solo on an album recorded that same year, 1959. And I'm referring to the album Milestones. And this excerpt is off Straight No Chaser. And here Miles starts his solo on the second measure of this blues progression. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice the period on the upbeat here at the end of both phrases. Also notice the use of motif development. Listen to how he varies the initial motif the second time around. Let's hear it one more time. 1, 2, 3, 4. The use of motif development in the phrase we just heard brings to mind a fact that many failed to take into account in regards to Miles. Yes, he was a genius, but unlike many of his contemporaries, he had the good fortune to study in one of the best music schools in the world at the time. Miles went to Juilliard and was exposed to all the composition techniques employed by the classical masters. This includes many concepts, among which were counterpoint and, yes, motif development. So when Miles employed these interesting melodic and rhythmic devices, he didn't just pull them out of thin air. He actually spent a considerable amount of time practicing how to develop them in his playing. So next time you hear someone say, so-and-so is just running scales, this is in part what they are talking about. Of course, Miles used scales, but it's not enough to just play the right scales. To say something, you need to use punctuation in your solos. You need to use the proper grammar. And with that said, before we go forward in Miles's career, let's examine a couple of excerpts from an album recorded in 1956. Miles Davis and the Modern Jazz Giants. This first example is from his opening to his solo on Swing Spring. 1, 2, 3, 4. Here we can see the punctuation on the upbeat of 3 in the first measure, and the upbeat of 2 in the second measure, and finally on the downbeat of 3 on the fourth measure. This one is off Miles' solo on Bemsha Swing, a blues by Thelonious Monk. 1, 2, 3, 4. Notice how this one is a longer opening, yet effectively uses the concept of punctuation in the third measure on the upbeat of 1, and after a rest on the upbeat of 3. And next, one more from 1956 before we go forward. And this one's from the album Relaxin' with the Miles Davis Quintet, off of Miles's opening to his solo on It Could Happen to You. But before I proceed, I just want to say that if this is your first time on the Jazz Guitar channel, let me introduce myself once again. My name is Richie Zellon, and here on YouTube I bring you weekly lessons on everything related to the art of playing jazz guitar. So please consider subscribing and be sure to click the notification bell icon so you won't miss anything. 1, 2, 3. This one starts with a long pickup and then starts the solo by accentuating the downbeats. Actually, downbeats 1 and 4 in the first measure, completing the first motific phrase on the downbeat of 1 on the second measure of the solo. Notice how in this same measure he then starts a pickup to repeat the same motif over measures 3 and 4. Due to its simplicity, this is a very effective opening statement which easily grabs the listener and creates anticipation for how it is going to further develop. So now let's move several years forward in Miles's career. These next two were recorded on the 1961 album, Someday My Prince Will Come. And this first example is from his opening in his solo over the title track. Listen to the simplicity of this opening statement, and especially how the placement of the eighth notes and the space in between them helps make the whole thing swing.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Some interesting use of rhythmic displacement on that one. In the first measure, Miles places a period on the downbeat of 2. On the second measure, he places the period on the downbeat of 3. And on the third measure, he places it on the upbeat of 2. So let's examine another classic from that same album. This is Miles's opening on his second chorus over Prancing, which is a blues.
1, 2, 3, 4.
Wow, I love that one. Notice how he repeats the same motif on the first two measures, ending each time on the upbeat of 3. This really creates a strong sense of syncopation and really gives the space in between a purpose. He then starts another phrase on the second beat of the third measure, which concludes on the fourth measure on the upbeat of 4. And I've got 2 more for you. Are you beginning to get a feel for this concept of punctuation? If you want to study this further, you can download a PDF from my website featuring all these examples with regular notation and tablature, as well as an MP3 for each one. And you will find a link to my site on the info section down below. Okay, let's move forward to 1965. And this one's from the album ESP, off Miles's opening to his solo on 81, a modal blues by Wayne Shorter.
1, 2, 3.
So we see that as the years progress, Miles's use of punctuation is still an integral part of his solos, and especially his openings. Notice here on measure 1, the definite period on the upbeat of 1, followed by space for the rest of the measure. He then uses the second measure as a pickup to repeat the same motif at the beginning of the third measure. And the symmetry and the placement of these 2 eighth note motifs really will grab the listener. And with that said, we've got time for one more. This one is from 1966 from the album Miles Smiles. And it's off Miles's opening to his solo on the classic Wayne Shorter composition, Footprints. I'm sure most of you are familiar with this one, but for those who aren't, let me just say that this one's a minor blues in 6/8 time. However, to make it easier to understand, since I've got a lot of guitarists watching that already have enough trouble with 4/4 notation, I'm displaying it here in 3/4 time.
1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3.
Again, similar to what we saw in the previous example, we see the repeated use of a short 2 eighth note motif ending on an upbeat with plenty of breathing space in between for the listener to meditate on the meaning of his statement. Before I sign off, I want to encourage you to study these examples and take these concepts and experiment adapting them to your solos. I want to remind you that a PDF with all 10 examples and 10 MP3s are available for download from my website. As usual, I welcome your comments and questions. Let me know if you enjoyed this lesson, and if so, I'll keep bringing you more. Also, if you are new and enjoyed it, please subscribe and don't forget to click on the notification bell icon so you won't miss any of my upcoming lessons. So until we meet again, here is another lesson I'm sure you'll enjoy.